Chapter 17. Although Su Len had lived in this world for more than 10 years, he was still not used to the city environment. Apart from the nobles' district and the merchants' district, the sanitation in the other areas was too poor. Now that he was developing his own territory, Su Len naturally wouldn't let his city become like that. "Boss, look, the signal." Just as Su Len was checking the progress of the construction of the territory, a barbarian warrior pointed to the northeast and shouted. Su Len looked up and saw a cloud of black smoke in the distance. Sullen's eyes flashed as he leaped onto the city wall. After setting up the camp, Su Len had already built a few beacon towers around the territory. These towers were simple in structure. They were made of mud and then turned into stone using mud to rock. There were some things to ignite the fire inside. He had also arranged for people to stand guard on the towers. If they discovered an enemy invasion, they would light the beacon immediately to alert the territory and send a signal. One beacon meant that there were about 100 enemies. 2 beacons meant that there were more than 500 enemies. If there were 3 beacons, it meant that there were more than 1,000 enemies. Su Len stood on the walls of the camp. 2 beacons were clearly visible in the distance. It was obvious that there were at least 500 enemies this time. Seeing this situation, Su Luen didn't delay and immediately ordered all the kobolds and goblins to be locked up in the fence in the camp. He didn't trust these slaves at all. What if these goblins and kobolds rebelled while he was leading people to fight the enemy? As for killing them, what would happen to the construction of the territory? Therefore, he could only lock them up temporarily. Immediately tell everyone to return to the team. Also, tell the mercenaries to help defend. Su Len ordered directly. "Yes, boss." The barbarian warrior beside him immediately ran to pass on the order. After the order was given, the camp immediately became busy. The kobolds and goblins were locked up in the fence, and the 35 barbarian warriors quickly gathered. After this period of battle, half of these barbarian warriors had become barbarian warriors. The leader, Johnson, had even advanced to become a giant axe berserker. This team of barbarian soldiers was much stronger than when they first entered the wilderness. Just as the barbarians finished gathering, the mercenaries also hurried over. "Master Su Len, I think we should abandon this place and leave as soon as possible." As soon as he walked over, Xion, the leader of the mercenaries, said impatiently, "Those gnolls, goblins, and kobolds are still far away from us. If we leave now, we have a great chance of escaping." Su Len looked at Jean coldly until his voice became softer and softer. Finally, he stopped. "Are you done?" Su Len said coldly as he looked at the embarrassed Xion. "If you are, then listen to me. This time, there will be no less than 500 enemies, but the highest number will not exceed 1,000. This is a crisis, but also an opportunity. As long as we can defeat this batch of enemies, then we will have a long period of development in the future. Similarly, if you perform well in this battle, I will give him 20 mu of farmland after the construction of the territory is completed. If he makes enough contributions, I will bestow him the title of a knight." In order to deal with this crisis, Su Len offered enough benefits. It was not easy to become a noble. Now, there was a shortcut in front of them. Hearing Sullen's promise, the low morale of the mercenaries instantly soared. They all rubbed their hands together, and their eyes were filled with eagerness. Su Len was very satisfied with this situation. To be honest, it was not impossible for Su Len to deal with 500 to 600 gnolls. It was mainly because the area of the camp was too big. With only 36 of them, they could not even line up a wall. The gnolls could easily go around the wall and destroy the camp. In this case, even if he killed all the gnolls, it would be useless. Ta-ta-ta. Just as Su Len was mobilizing the mercenaries, a date red horse galloped in the direction of the camp. As it galloped, it shouted, "Military emergency!" The surrounding people all dodged and let it pass. "Su Len, Monseigneur, this is not good. There are 700 enemies this time. In addition to the gnolls, and kobolds, there are also a dozen trolls." The mercenary knight ran to Su Len and agilely jumped off the horse. "Thank you for your hard work. Go and rest." Su Len smiled at him and said, take out the white bread and bacon. I remember there is some ale in the warehouse. Take it out this time as well. Su Len said to the barbarian warrior behind him. At this time, to boost morale, Su Len had prepared a sumptuous meal. Yes, boss. I will take someone to take it out. The barbarian warrior behind him said respectfully. Also, take out the bacon and sausages. The fish must also be served today. Su Len ordered directly. In this world, apart from the nobles and merchants, everyone else basically had 2 meals a day. This time, because of the upcoming war, lunch was specially added. I want to see all the warriors and mercenaries eat meat this afternoon. Yes, Monseigneur. I will prepare it immediately. The chef was sweating profusely and said nervously. The fish were cut open one by one. In the empty space in the middle of the camp, a dozen large pots were boiling hot water. The slaughtered fish were cut into pieces and then placed directly into the pot to cook. Pieces of bacon and sausages were thrown into the pots after being cut. Although the chef's skills were not very good, the enticing aroma still made people swallow their saliva uncontrollably. The people did not have to wait for too long. The food was finally ready. Su Len picked up a bowl and filled it with delicious meat soup. He then took a piece of white bread and took a bite. Seeing that Su Len was the first to eat, the mercenaries and barbarians swarmed forward and took their share. The meat soup was delicious. There were mushrooms, bacon, and ham in it. Su Len found a rock and squatted on it to drink the soup. The barbarian warrior was also very quiet. He sat on the ground with a bowl of meat soup and a piece of white bread in one hand. According to the previous reports, there were more than 700 enemies this time. Half of them were goblins and kobolds, about 300 to 400 of them. The rest were gnolls and a dozen trolls. Trolls were a powerful creature. They were far more powerful than gnolls. They were very strong and liked to use maces. However, their strongest point was their terrifying regenerative ability. Broken limbs could be regrown. Only magic, fire, or strong acid could truly kill them. P.S. There were some problems with the contract, so it was remailed. It will probably be fixed on Monday. Chapter 18. In Sullen's camp, there were only 35 barbarians and 40 mercenaries who could fight. As for the slave craftsmen, their fighting power was negligible. Besides, Su Len was reluctant to let them fight on the battlefield. The cost of these slave craftsmen was much higher than the barbarians. Just these 45 slaves cost more than 1,000 kinner. If these slave craftsmen died on the battlefield, he would have no money to buy more. After a sumptuous lunch, Su Len asked the mercenaries to start organizing their equipment. Then he led the mercenaries to the wall in the northeast. Because of the lack of time, most of the wall in the camp had not been turned into stone. Part of it was on the east side. There were only 2 gates in Sullen's territory. One was on the east side, and the other was on the west side. This time, the enemy was coming from the northeast. There was a high chance that they would attack the east gate. Su Len was going to set up some traps here. The barbarians were experts in setting traps. When they hunted in the wilderness, they often relied on traps. Although these traps were not very effective against large numbers of monsters, they could still kill as many as they could. While the barbarians were making traps, Su Luen, together with the remaining 45 slave craftsmen, moved out the dried reeds collected these days and piled them near the east gate. Time passed by. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The south was still hot, but the northern wilderness was already very cool. The autumn air was refreshing. In the distance, a black line was quickly approaching. When they got closer, they realized that it was not a black line. It was a huge army made up of thousands of goblins, gnolls, kobolds, and gnolls. In fact, rather than an army, they were more like a group of bandits. No, they were worse than bandits. Most of them did not even have clothes, and the weapons in their hands were mostly wooden sticks or bone weapons. Only the gnolls used crude metal weapons. Although many of the weapons looked inferior at first glance, they were still metal weapons. In addition to these monsters, Su Len also saw a few tall monsters. These monsters were even taller than the gnolls. Their bodies were muscular and looked very powerful. Su Len had seen pictures of monsters before. These monsters were trolls. Although the trolls were few in number, they were far stronger than the gnolls. Although there were only a dozen of them, they could easily defeat a group of 100 gnolls. The maces in the hands of these trolls were at least 40 to 50 kilograms in weight. They looked ugly, and there was still iron residue on them that hadn't melted, but their power hadn't decreased at all. The number of monsters in this group was also different from the information they received. There were at least 1,400 monsters in this group, which was double the number of monsters that Sullen's group had. This number was almost 20 times more than the number of monsters that Sullen's group had. The mercenaries standing on the city walls felt their hearts race, and their hands and feet turned cold. Looking at the monsters in the distance, their minds went blank, and their eyes were filled with fear. If it weren't for the fact that they knew they couldn't outrun monsters in the wilderness, these mercenaries would have dropped their weapons and fled long ago. Seeing this, Su Len shook his head inwardly. These mercenaries' mental fortitude was too weak. Master Su Len, there are more than 1,000 of these monsters, and we have less than 100 people. We can't defend against their attacks at all. This is no longer a matter of saving face for the nobles. I suggest we drive away the gnoll and kobold slaves, abandon all our supplies, and retreat immediately, Xion said anxiously. Retreat? Why should we retreat? With these chickens and dogs? Su Len slapped the city wall and laughed. I think they're too few. With so many slaves, as long as we capture half of them, I'll be able to build my lord's castle very quickly. Hearing Sullen's words, the mercenaries looked at each other. They looked at Su Len as if they were looking at an idiot. The barbarians, on the other hand, were cheering for Su Len. Although they had followed Su Len for less than a month, these barbarians were completely loyal to Su Len. They would carry out Sullen's orders without hesitation. Just as the mercenaries were struggling to escape, the army of monsters outside launched an attack. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Arrows were thrown from afar. Su Len swung his spear lightly and deflected all the arrows aimed at him. The barbarians also swung their weapons and deflected the arrows. Only a few unlucky mercenaries were hit, but the arrows were too weak. The arrowheads couldn't even penetrate their leather armor. The gnolls' archery skills were very poor. Their strength was limited and they couldn't use strong bows. Most of the arrowheads were made of bone. It was effective against unarmored monsters, but it was useless against Su Len and the others. Seeing that the arrows were ineffective, the gnolls roared angrily and waved their maces, sending a gnoll who couldn't dodge in time flying. They then roared at the army of monsters, and the entire army began to attack the city. A distance of 30 to 40 meters was covered in a few seconds. However, many of the monsters had just charged 10 meters when they either stepped into a pit, had their sawls pierced by wooden spikes, or were hit in the head by falling rocks. Some unlucky ones fell and were trampled to death by the monsters behind them. However, these didn't stop the army of monsters. Soon the gate was breached. Su Len didn't send anyone to stop them. Instead, he led the barbarians and mercenaries to retreat to the camp. The monsters were very excited to break through the gate so easily. In their minds, human fortresses were difficult to break through, but as long as they broke through, there would be rich spoils of war. Sweet food, beautiful clothes, all kinds of beautiful objects, and tender human flesh. These hot-headed monsters didn't care how the camp was breached so easily. Regardless of whether they were gnolls, or gnolls, they all swarmed toward the gate. Behind the gate, the kobolds who rushed in first wanted to rush in and loot, but they were dumbfounded when they saw two stone walls on both sides of the gate. Before they could figure out what was going on, they were pushed forward by more monsters behind them. These two stone walls were created by Sullen's mud to stone skill. There were a total of 30 meters of stone walls on both sides of the east gate. With two stone walls blocking their way, the gnolls were able to move forward. It didn't take long for the monsters to see their enemies. Two teams of 30 barbarian warriors held their giant axes and waited. They didn't dodge and they couldn't dodge. In a breath, these barbarian warriors came into contact with the army of monsters. They swung their giant axes, and blood and flesh flew everywhere. The monsters in the front line fell like wheat being harvested. Chapter 19. The battle had been intense since the beginning. Faced with the barbarians' sharp battle axes, goblins, kobolds, and even gnolls could not withstand more than 2 hits. The ground where the 2 sides were fighting was soon dyed red with blood. In the narrow space, the goblins and kobolds did not even have a chance to escape. They were directly cut in half by the axes. The first row of barbarian warriors was tired, and the second row immediately took their place. The barbarian warriors took turns killing the monsters, and their efficiency was not affected at all. The monsters in front were blocked by the barbarians and could not move an inch forward. Seeing their companions being killed so easily, many goblins, kobolds, and gnolls wanted to retreat. However, the monsters at the back did not know what was happening in front of them and continued to charge forward. In the end, hundreds of monsters had squeezed into the area 30 meters behind the east gate of the camp, and the number was still increasing. Sulen stood on the high platform at the back and looked at the monsters flooding in from the east gate of the camp. His expression did not change at all. After seeing that the space surrounded by the stone wall was filled with monsters, Sulen decisively ordered a retreat. The barbarians who had resisted at the exit for more than 10 minutes all retreated. Although it was only a short 10 minutes, they had used up as much energy as a battle. The continuous high-intensity battle had also tired them out. After the barbarians retreated, the monsters who were no longer under pressure were overjoyed and wanted to rush out quickly. However, as soon as the first batch of barbarians rushed out, a stone wall suddenly rose from the ground and blocked the passage in a breath. The gnolls and goblins who could not stop in time slammed into the stone wall. For a moment, dust flew everywhere. Some of the weaker monsters had their sternum crushed and blood spurted out of their mouths. Many gnolls wanted to climb over the stone wall, but the crowded space did not give them a chance to do so. Some lucky ones directly stepped on the bodies of the goblins and kobolds and climbed over the stone wall. However, as soon as they landed, they were stabbed by 5 or 6 mercenaries with spears. Seeing the army of monsters in the simple barbican, Sullen's face revealed a bloodthirsty smile. Under the afterglow of the setting sun, there was a hint of ferocity. Boom! The spear slammed into the ground. Set fire! A loud shout clearly spread throughout the battlefield. In the next second, dozens of torches suddenly rose around the barbican. Then, cans of burning kerosene were thrown into the barbican. Boom! The kerosene instantly ignited into a raging fire. Even the reed poles that had been piled up in the barbican were set ablaze. The monsters that had been tainted by the oil slapped their hands frantically, trying to put out the fire. However, other than igniting more places, there was no effect at all. All the monsters frantically tried to escape, but the surrounding monsters made it impossible for them to move. Even the previous city gate suddenly dropped a 1,000-pound gate. The entire barbican was completely sealed off in an instant. The flames in the barbican grew bigger and bigger. Many gnolls' fur was instantly ignited. The flames burned wantonly in this space, and the screams of the monsters could be heard everywhere. The monsters that were trapped in a desperate situation became even crazier. In order to survive, they began to attack the other monsters around them, trying to clear enough space so that they could step on the corpses of their companions to escape the barbican. However, the moment these monsters landed on the ground, they were killed by the barbarian warriors or mercenaries guarding the perimeter before they could even celebrate. The fire dyed the sky red, and the temperature of the entire camp rose by several degrees. The monsters in the barbican were even more uncomfortable. There was a burning smell in the air, mixed with the fragrance of meat. The stone walls were slightly red from the heat, and the flames showed no signs of weakening. Although the reeds and kerosene had been burned out, the oil from the animals became the new fuel. Countless gnolls and kobolds that were still alive kept wailing. These sounds were getting weaker and weaker. The flames had used up all the oxygen in the area. Many monsters that were not burned to death by the flames died of suffocation. The entire barbican had become a fiery hell. Monsters were burned to ashes in the flames. The scorching heat waves rolled. Even the mercenaries who were close to the barbican had their hair curled up. The scorching flames had burned their skin red. These mercenaries, who had been thinking of escaping before, were now all excited. They held their weapons and killed the monsters that escaped from the sea of fire. After Su Len started the fire, he no longer paid attention to the turtles in the barbican. In his eyes, the monsters in the barbican were already dead. Although there were a large number of gnolls, and kobolds in the barbican, there were still some outside the barbican. He did not plan to let these monsters go. After all, he was severely lacking in slaves. Su Len went around the west gate of the camp. When he arrived at the east gate, the monsters were smashing the gate. To prevent the monsters in the barbican from escaping, the 1,000-pound gate was specially thickened. Although it had been dented by the attacks of the two trolls, it still did not break. The flames in the barbican made the monsters feel that something was wrong. However, the monster army was in a mess. It was too late to retreat even if they wanted to. After seeing Su Len and 30 barbarian warriors rushing over, a tall and strong gnoll wearing rough iron armor, who looked like the leader, howled. Then the chaotic monster army began to gather. Even the trolls that were attacking the gate turned around and rushed over. Looking at the regrouped monster army, Su Luen narrowed his eyes. To be honest, he was a little surprised by this monster army. This group of monsters didn't rush up like a swarm of bees like the ones he had encountered before. They were actually disciplined. Although this monster army's discipline was very poor, this was already a big improvement. At the front were the cannon fodder gnolls, followed by a few trolls. There were also gnolls on the left and right. Although the formation was messy, it did not mean that it was ineffective. The gnolls in the front row formed a long spear formation. Although their weapons were sharpened bones and sharp stones, they were still lethal. Su Len buttoned up his beast-faced iron armor, then picked up a 3-meter-long spear and stretched his body. The barbarian warriors were on both sides of him. These barbarian warriors formed a conical formation, and Su Len was the arrowhead at the front. Charge! When the distance between the two sides was less than 100 meters, Su Len roared and rushed forward. The barbarians followed closely behind him. 100 meters was a distance that could be crossed in less than 10 seconds. Although Su Len and the others only had 30 or so people, when they charged, they had an unstoppable momentum. An invisible pressure enveloped the entire battlefield. Chapter 20. More than 30 barbarian warriors ran like lightning, the sharp axes in their hands shining with a cold light. If they were facing the elite soldiers of the Kingdom of Florence's Giant Bear Legion, these barbarians would have suffered heavy casualties even if they charged. However, they were facing these unarmored barbarians. How could mere flesh and blood stop them? 50 meters. Seeing Su Len and the barbarians getting closer, the kobold archers behind the phalanx shot their arrows. The arrows fell from the sky like raindrops. Su Len waved his spear and deflected the arrows. The barbarian warriors behind him used their giant axes to protect their vital parts and let the arrows fall on their bodies. Most of the arrows did not penetrate the leather armor, and some were even deflected. These arrows did not cause any trouble for Su Len and the others. In the blink of an eye, they were only 20 meters away. Next was the phalanx in front of them. Although these gnomes were not strong, if they rushed in recklessly, Su Len would be fine, but the barbarians would definitely suffer losses. Hand axes. Throw. In the next moment, 35 hand axes flew into the phalanx. How strong were the barbarians? The hand axes that were thrown out instantly broke the phalanx of the gnomes into pieces. Many gnomes were directly beheaded by the hand axes. The phalanx of the phalanx lost its formation and could not withstand a single blow. Su Len led the barbarians behind him and rushed into the phalanx of the gnomes. Like a gust of wind sweeping away fallen leaves, they swept the phalanx of the gnomes into a pile of trash. The kobolds behind the phalanx of the gnomes collapsed. A huge gap appeared in the formation of the monster army. Su Len and the barbarians were like a shining steel knife that stabbed directly into the enemy's chest. The phalanx of the phalanx continued to advance without stopping. All the monsters in front of Su Len were completely crushed. After continuously penetrating the phalanx of the gnomes and the kobolds, they crashed into the knolls. To be able to survive in the wilderness and become a medium-sized tribe, these jackalans were not weak. They were even more valiant than the ones Su Len had encountered before. After seeing Su Len and the others rushing over, the group of gnolls roared. Su Len swept the spear in his hand, and with his inhuman strength, the iron spear shaft tore through the air and instantly swept the gnolls in front of him away. After being swept by the spear shaft, the gnolls' bodies began to break. Their sternum and spine were shattered, and their internal organs were shattered into pieces by this strange force. Then, mixed with blood, they spurted out from their mouths and noses. Taking advantage of the gap that Su Len had opened, the remaining barbarians swung their axes and activated windmill. Whirlwind slashes with white sword energy cut the monsters in front of them into two halves. Flesh and blood splattered everywhere, and the gnolls were easily harvested like weeds. Seeing Su Len and the others rushing forward, the leader of the gnolls kept roaring, wanting to command the others to continue attacking. However, the group of monsters was already scared out of their wits. No matter how much he roared, they were unwilling to move forward. Fortunately, they still had a trump card in their team, which was 9 trolls that were more than 5 meters tall. Just as Su Len swept the last gnoll in front of him away, the front was empty. The entire army of monsters had been pierced through by him. The entire battlefield was in chaos. The middle of the army of monsters had completely collapsed, and the 2 wings were useless at this time. Roar! Just as Su Len was about to kill the leader of the gnolls, an angry roar came from the side. Then, a gust of wind approached quickly. A troll rushed over like a heavy truck. Su Len waved his arm and blocked the mace. The huge force bent the long spear made of fine iron. The mace was lifted high, and the troll that was rushing over retreated at an even faster speed. Then it fell heavily to the ground. Blood spurted out of its mouth. With such a serious injury, other monsters would have died long ago. However, for the trolls, as long as they were given time, they would recover in a short time. It was not that they had not encountered difficult opponents before, but in the end, they had relied on the strength of the trolls to win in the end. Unfortunately, they had calculated wrongly this time. Seeing Su Len send a troll flying, the remaining trolls were not afraid at all. They roared and rushed at him. Seeing the trolls rushing over, Su Len smiled coldly. He grabbed the shaft of the spear with one hand and the body of the spear with the other. Then, he bent the spear hard and straightened the somewhat deformed spear. Then, he waved it hard at the trolls. Dark ice cut. 3 streams of cold air gathered in front of him in an instant, then condensed into 3 ice blades, accompanied by a bone-piercing chill. The 3 ice blades flew out in an instant. The surrounding gnolls only felt their bodies become stiff. In the next second, a bone-piercing chill flashed by, and then they were plunged into endless darkness. The 3 ice blades cut through the trolls' bodies like rotten wood. Several of the charging trolls stopped in their tracks. In the next moment, their strong bodies were neatly cut into several pieces. No blood flowed out. All of the blood was frozen in an instant. Even the trolls' bodies were frozen at this moment. The 3 ice blades flew for more than 30 meters before disappearing into the air. All monsters in the path of the ice blades, whether gnolls, or trolls, were cut and frozen. The trolls that had the powerful ability to grow again were also dead. The mercenaries on the city wall watched everything that happened on the battlefield not far away. They only felt a chill in their hearts, and their bodies involuntarily broke out in a cold sweat. Although they had seen the Lord's invincible posture on the battlefield several times, the opponents this time were trolls. The powerful and unstoppable force that swept through the battlefield made them feel like the noble in front of them was a mythical hero. Legendary heroes are nothing more than this, Xion said with a pale voice. Just as the mercenaries were sighing, the battle came to an end. After seeing that their biggest reliance was killed, the entire monster army completely collapsed. No one dared to stop them. After seeing this situation, the gnoll leader turned around and ran without saying a word, but it was already too late. Su Len moved very quickly, and the enemies in front of him dodged. Those who dodged too slowly were directly torn apart by the power of Sullen's spear. The Knoll leader saw the distance between the two rapidly closing, and then madly accelerated to escape. Sulen shook the spear in his hand and then threw it forward with force. Chapter 21. The spear pierced through the air and pierced through the Knoll leader with a sharp whistling sound before nailing it to the ground. The Knoll leader's body twitched a few times before it slowly lowered its head. Dark red blood flowed down the spear to the ground. Seeing the Knoll leader nailed to death by the spear, the natives felt a chill run through their bodies, causing them to tremble uncontrollably. As the murderous god's eyes swept over them, they all lowered their heads. No one dared to look directly at him. That gaze gave them the feeling that it was several times colder than the cold wind of the northern ice plains. After the battle concluded, Su Luin did not have time to rest and led the barbarians to capture slaves. Because the monster army had come from afar, adding on the intense battle, the barbarians had used up all of their strength. Even if they wanted to run, they did not have the strength to do so. Soon, they had captured a large number of slaves. An epic victory. Under your command, you and your army won an epic victory. As the war ended, the monsters that were lucky enough to escape spread your deeds far and wide. Your name began to spread across the wastelands. Your prestige +1. The battle is over. You have received 15,432 experience points. Your level has increased. You have received 2 free attribute points and 2 skill points. You have received 2 silver treasure chests. In this battle you have received Gem X5. Name, Sullen Race. Human level, 14, 235-814-0000. Strength, 26 Agility, 28 Spirit, 23 Constitution, 25 Charm. 18 The other attributes did not change, but this time, there was an additional prestige, 1. The description was very simple. Your name has spread in a small area in the wilderness. In this battle, other than Sulen who leveled up, the other barbarians also leveled up. This time, none of the barbarians died. Only 3 of them were seriously injured. As for the light injuries, they were all slightly injured. This low casualty rate was because Sulen took the brunt of the danger. If it was not for Sullen's powerful strength, the barbarians would have suffered more casualties. Boss, a few of our brothers are seriously injured. I'm afraid they won't make it. Johnson came to Sullen's side and said sadly, the development of medicine in this world was very slow. Most of the time, they had to rely on the divine arts of the temple priests for treatment. Of course, they could also spend money to buy some holy water. There were no doctors in Sullen's territory, and no priests would follow the nobles to expand the territory. As for holy water, the cheapest holy water cost 10 kinner. With Sullen's stinginess, how could he buy it? However, although there was no sacrifice or holy water, Su Luin had the life-healing technique. Take me there, Sulen said directly. Soon, Sulen saw the 3 heavily injured barbarians. The wounds on their bodies were lacerations, which should have been caused by the Knoll warriors. These monsters were over 2 meters tall and were stronger than the Knoll barbarian soldiers. The barbarians only wore leather armor, and at most, their leather armor was embedded with some metal plates. These leather armor could deal with gnolls, kobolds, and gnolls, but it would be difficult to deal with the Knoll warriors. Against the Knoll warriors, these leather armor would not be of much use. The most seriously injured barbarian had a large gash on his chest, and 2 of his ribs were broken. Through the wound, one could see that his internal organs were squirming. With such serious injuries, his stomach was almost cut open. If the wound was a little deeper, he probably wouldn't have lasted until now. Sulen raised his hand, and a ball of light green light began to gather in his hand. In the next second, the light merged into the barbarian's body. The barbarian's wounds gradually stopped bleeding, and the hideous wound on his body began to close. However, the wound was only closed by a third before the green light disappeared. Obviously, life healing was not enough to save them. The green light dissipated, and the barbarian's HP continued to drop, but at a much slower rate than before. Seeing the light dissipate, Sulen used life healing on the barbarian again. Although the barbarian's wounds had not healed, his HP was no longer dropping. Life healing was only a beginner-level healing spell, and its effects were limited. The rest of the wounds would need to be healed by himself. Soon, Sulen pulled the 3 barbarian warriors back from the brink of death. Then, he applied gold balm on them, tied them with bandages, and had them carried back to the camp to recuperate. They would not be able to fight for at least a month. After the battle, the dozen or so barbarian warriors had all leveled up to become barbarian warriors. The most powerful one, Johnson, had broken through to become the ultimate barbarian soldier, the barbarian berserker. Several of his attributes had also leveled up. Beginner strength had leveled up to intermediate strength, and endurance had leveled up to intermediate endurance. Intermediate strength permanently increases strength by 4 points, stamina by 4 points. Intermediate endurance permanently increases HP by 25 points, stamina by 25 points, stamina recovery by 50%, and damage taken reduced by 15%. Apart from these 2 attributes, the attributes of Berserk had also changed. Berserk had become Advanced Berserk, reducing pain by 80%, increasing strength by 50%, increasing movement speed by 20%, Berserk duration by 50%, and reducing weakness by 30%. Could be said that Johnson's strength had increased by several times. If he was equipped with a set of armor, he would be a meat grinder on the battlefield. After the battle, Sulen obtained a large number of slaves. This time, the slaves included gnomes, kobolds, and gnolls, totaling up to 500. Among them, more than 200 had died in the battle, and those that died in the Barbican were not included. Sulen estimated that about 600 of them had died, and less than 100 had escaped. After this battle, the captives were all frightened and did not dare to resist. Sulen planned to keep them as slaves. Gnomes and gnomes were very similar, but the former was 1.5 meters tall while the latter was only 1.2 meters tall. Gnomes were also one of the few races in the wasteland with good discipline. Although they were not very bright, they were more than enough to be slaves. Johnson, take these slaves back and lock them up alone. Sulen walked back, covered in blood. With every step he took, blood dripped from the gaps in his armor. Remember, don't let them escape. I still need these people to build me a castle. Don't worry, boss. I'll guard it myself. Johnson wiped off the blood stains on his bald head and grinned at the slaves, revealing 2 rows of white teeth. Although he was smiling, the blood stains on his face made people's hearts palpitate. Johnson would not let these monsters who had almost killed his brothers go so easily. Although he would not kill them, he would not let them off easily. Chapter 22. The fire in the Barbican burned until midnight before it gradually extinguished. The fire burned the surrounding walls and ground until it was hot. It was not until the next morning that Sulen dismantled the Barbican and began to clean up the corpses inside. After seeing the scene in the Barbican, although Sulen was already mentally prepared, he still felt the urge to vomit. The Barbican was filled with all kinds of charred corpses, and the air was filled with the smell of barbecue. This situation caused no one to eat meat in the camp for the next few days. He dug a big hole and buried all the corpses. Then he let the slaves clean the ground with water. Even so, there was still a faint smell of blood at the east gate of the camp. After dealing with the monster army, the camp ushered in a period of rapid development. This time, the native army they destroyed was the most powerful Gnoll tribe in the area. The destruction of this tribe made the other tribes in the area feel a lingering fear. The rules in the wilderness were very simple. The strong were the king. If Sulen wanted the ownership of this land, he had to defeat all the forces around the land. This way, he would be the ruler of this land. Now that the largest tribe around Sulen's territory had been destroyed, no one dared to provoke him for the time being. With more than 1,000 slaves, the construction of the camp sped up again. 3 days later, the construction of the port was finally completed. The port was built, and the fish provided every day increased. Next, some of the slaves continued to cultivate the farmland, while others built the blacksmith shop and the lord's castle. During this period of time, there were frequent battles. Many people's armor and weapons were seriously damaged and needed to be repaired before they could be used. However, there was no iron ore in the territory. If Sulen wanted to build a blacksmith shop in the territory, he had to solve the source of iron ore. Although the wilderness looked barren, there were still many resources, such as iron ore. Most of the gnolls who attacked Sulen's territory had metal weapons. These metal weapons looked rough, and many of them even had a lot of slag left, but they were still metal weapons. These crude weapons were better made by human blacksmith apprentices. In fact, these weapons were all produced by the Jackalan tribe. The Jackalans were also intelligent beings with high intelligence. They also knew how to smelt steel, but their level was too low. If they could make metal weapons, then where did the raw materials come from? Humans had long since sealed off the wastelands, and iron ore weapons were not allowed to be sold to these monsters. Therefore, the most reasonable explanation was that the Jackalans in this camp had discovered an iron mine. It just so happened that they knew some smelting techniques, but they themselves were half-baked. The weapons they made were naturally very crude. Because of the iron ore discovered by the Jackalans, Su Luin was not worried that there would be no raw materials after the blacksmith shop was built. As for occupying the iron mine now, he also wanted to occupy it, but he only had a little more than 100 people now. He was simply powerless to do so. Only when his camp had more people would he go and take the iron mine. In addition to iron ore, Sulen also needed to find a coal mine, which was the fuel for making iron. Temporary Lord's residence. How many supplies do we have now? Sulen sat on a recliner, squinting slightly as he asked his clerk. This clerk was chosen from the slaves. He could read and count. Although his standard was average, he had to make do until there was no better one. Monseigneur, we've used up a lot of supplies. You've also captured a lot of slaves recently. Our food consumption has doubled. We don't have much money left. We only have 300 kinner left. We've already paid the mercenaries their commission. We don't even have enough money left to buy supplies in Cult. The clerk said with a book in his hand. We need to build our territory and buy slaves to increase the population. 300 kinner is just a drop in the bucket, Sulen said as he rubbed his chin. The territory's development had reached a bottleneck. The reason was the population problem. Although there were thousands of slaves, if there was no one watching over them, they wouldn't work obediently. Once Sulen's manpower was spread out, he would be faced with the problem of not having enough manpower. Johnson, Sulen shouted. I'm here, boss. Johnson walked in from outside the door. Go back with some men and bring your wives and children here. It's safe here now, Sulen said with a smile. Really? I'll go arrange it right away. Johnson was indescribably excited when he heard that he could bring his wife and children back. Go and come back quickly. Sulen waved his hand impatiently. The barbarian's wife and children should be doing well. Although they were old and weak, the fighting strength of these women should not be underestimated. By the way, when you go back, spread the news that Sir Sulen has successfully built his territory in the wilderness. He needs all kinds of resources now, Sulen said after thinking for a while. He planned to lure the merchants to trade with him. As for the trade, he hadn't thought about it yet. Johnson left the camp with 2 giant axe warriors. Sulen didn't go out to capture any more slaves. In fact, the monster tribes around his territory had already noticed, and many of them had already left the area. After a few days of construction, the blacksmith shop was finally completed. The blacksmith shop is completed. Importing equipment data. Importing metal smelting technology, metal casting technology. Import completion 10%, 20%, 50%. Import complete. The weapon and equipment section of the system store has been opened. Just as the blacksmith shop was completed, the cold voice of the system rang in his ears. Sulen was overjoyed. He quickly checked the rise of the Empire system in his mind. Blacksmith shop. The blacksmith shop can forge higher quality weapons for the warriors in the territory. The skills of the blacksmiths working in the blacksmith shop will be improved. The quality of the blacksmiths will also be improved. Blacksmith learning speed +2, production speed +1, quality of blacksmiths +1. In addition to the basic introduction, the gray shop button in the system interface lit up. When he opened the shop, a dazzling catalog of items appeared in front of him. There were bows, iron swords, spears, armors, and so on. Not only were there normal items, but there were also many high-quality weapons. Of course, there were no divine weapons like the Firmament Emperor's Sword, Snake Spear, or Sky Halberd. However, when he thought about it, it made sense. If they weren't even sold in the game, it would be difficult to get them in the real world. Chapter 23. Other than weapons, the blacksmith shop also sold materials such as refined iron, steel, dark steel, and godly iron. However, the prices made Sullen's heart ache. The normal prices were reasonable, but for 100-year-old dark steel, the price soared to 100,000 kinner. As for the more expensive materials such as Millennium Dark Steel, Ninth Heaven Dark Steel, and Perilous Tungsten Steel, they were not for sale. In the game, these rare materials could not only be used to create the best godly equipment, but they also had magical effects. For example, 100-year-old dark steel had a self-healing effect. When worn, it would automatically restore health after a period of time, and it could also increase attributes. In the past, it was a must-have item in the game. After checking the catalog in the blacksmith shop, Sulen also found some equipment crafting blueprints. After using them, one could learn how to craft equipment. There were also blacksmithing experiences that could be used to improve a blacksmith's forging skills. However, the price was expensive. One book cost 1,500 kinner. After looking through the blacksmith shop, Sulen realized that he could not afford a single set of equipment. Of course, the blacksmith shop could not only buy weapons but also let the blacksmith forge them. Although the blacksmith skills were not perfect, the price was much better. For example, the two-handed axes that Sulen bought for the barbarians cost 30 kinner. If he let the blacksmith forge one himself, it would cost 15 kinner at most. If he had his own iron or in the future, the price could be lowered further. In fact, although Sullen's barbarian army was strong, they were not at their best. For example, the barbarian warriors were equipped with two-handed axes, chainmail, hand axes, or javelins. When the barbarian warriors came, they were even equipped with iron armor. Only then could they unleash their full strength. Now, all the barbarians were equipped with two-handed axes, leather armor, and hand axes. They were the lowest equipment. However, now that the blacksmith shop was built, Sulen planned to slowly equip them with equipment. Sulen built the blacksmith shop by the river. He planned to install some hydraulic machines in the blacksmith shop when the technology was ready. For example, the hydraulic forging machine was not too difficult to install. It could only be used in places with abundant water. Back in Kalen City, his father's blacksmith shop had already used this kind of machine. Now, he planned to use this technology here. With the hydraulic forging machine, the cost of producing equipment could be further reduced. After this period of fighting, Sulen and the others had seized thousands of metal weapons and armors. These weapons were generally of low quality, but they were still qualified as raw materials. Bruce was a blacksmith slave that he had bought, and blacksmiths were gunners here. One had to know that blacksmiths belonged to the middle-income class in the town. This guy had owed a lot of gambling debts. Not only did he lose his blacksmith shop, but he was also sold as a slave. Monseigneur, this blacksmith shop is not a problem at all. As long as I have the materials, I can make farming tools and equipment. Bruce rubbed his hands and said with a flattering smile. After being a slave for a period of time, he had enough. Sulen nodded and said, "That's good. Repair the soldiers' equipment and make farming tools and other tools. In the future, your supplies will be upgraded to a higher level." "Thank you, Monseigneur. I will work hard." After hearing Sullen's words, Bruce said happily, if his supplies were upgraded, he would be able to eat fish. In the future, he would not have to squeeze in a room with others and endure the stench of other people's feet and the sound of teeth grinding. Sullen's management of slaves was considered very benevolent in this era. He had set a set of standards for rewards and punishments and corresponding treatment for the slaves. He used these standards to give the slaves hope, or rather, to increase the slaves' enthusiasm for work. If the slaves were just muddling along, their work would be passable. If they did well, there would be no rewards, and if they did poorly, there would be punishments. In the end, these slaves' work efficiency would definitely not be high. However, Sulen gave out rewards and set a label for the rewards. This was like hanging a carrot in front of a donkey. If the donkey wanted to eat the carrot, it would naturally run forward. The lowest level of slaves was the coolie, and their treatment was also the standard of not starving to death. Corresponding to that were the kobolds and goblins. These coolies were the most common. As for the skilled slaves, they would be given better food and work goals. They would only be given food after they completed their work. If they did well, they would be given additional rewards. If they went further, their treatment would be upgraded again, such as meat and other food. If the slave made a meritorious service or made other contributions, it could be upgraded again. It could have better food and could have a separate residence. At the end of the rewards, Sulen also promised that if the slave reached the required contribution, he would give the slave the status of a free person and let him become a free person in the territory. Of course, this did not mean that Sulen would lose out. In fact, Sulen's contribution standard was 10 times the price of the slaves. In other words, if a slave wanted to get rid of his status as a slave, he would have to provide at least 10 times the value of the slave. Also, do you think it's over after you get rid of your status as a slave? After becoming a free person, he would still have to pay taxes, work for him, and develop his territory. No matter how you looked at it, he would not lose out. After Sulen announced this reward and punishment system, the efficiency of the slaves in the territory doubled on the same day. After the blacksmith shop was built, Sulen brought the spoils of war over. He was going to let the blacksmiths smelt these scrap metals into iron ingots. Then he would use these iron ingots to repair the weapons of the barbarian warriors and make farming equipment and armor. Although the monsters in the wilderness were poor, Sulen had killed so many of them during this period of time that they would more or less have some metal weapons. After many little drops made an ocean, it was still a considerable amount. The biggest part was actually the spoils of war this time. Many of the gnolls and trolls that came to attack the territory this time used maces. Although these maces were crudely made and the metal smelting was not complete, they were still heavy. A single mace weighed at least 100 pounds. Even if there were many impurities in them, after smelting, they would still weigh 70 to 80 pounds. In the end, the number of iron ingots obtained was at least a few thousand pounds. Naturally, not many iron ingots were needed to repair weapons, so Sulen planned to use the remaining iron ingots to make armor for the barbarians. As for the iron of the worst quality, it would be used to make farming equipment. A few thousand pounds of iron ingots could be used to make almost 100 sets of armor. Although the barbarians were strong in attack, their defense was very weak. If these barbarians were all equipped with armor, their combat strength would at least increase by a level. Chapter 24. Bruce brought a few blacksmith apprentices to work. The slaves pushed a material cart and sent hundreds of pounds of scrap iron into the blast furnace. The blast furnace was hot, and the temperature of the entire blacksmith shop was at least 50 degrees. Bruce was bare-chested and only had a piece of cloth wrapped around his crotch. He directed the people to heat the blast furnace. Because there was no coal in Sulen, the blacksmith shop used charcoal for heating. The heat provided by charcoal was limited, only 700 degrees. Of course, this was in an open environment. If it was in a furnace, the temperature could reach 900 to 1000 degrees. The temperature needed for steel smelting was at least 1000 degrees. At this time, bellows were needed to help the combustion. Only in this way could the temperature reach the iron smelting temperature. Sulen didn't know much about iron smelting, but he remembered that after heating the air in advance and injecting it into the furnace, the temperature of the furnace could be increased by about 200 degrees. In this way, the temperature of the furnace could reach 1200 degrees, which was not much lower than using coal. In fact, although there were many advantages to using coal to smelt iron, such as fast smelting speed, high output, low cost, etc., there was a serious drawback. That was the sulfur content of coal. Most of the coal had a high sulfur content. If it was used to smelt iron, the iron would also contain sulfur, which would lead to a serious consequence. The iron would become brittle. The quality of the iron would decrease, and the weapons forged could not be compared with the weapons without sulfur. When the weapons were cut, they would even break directly. This situation could not be compensated for by the low cost. After all, no matter how low the cost was, if the things bought could not be used, then the money spent would be worthless. As for steelmaking, Sulen also knew a little about it. The difference between steel and iron was the amount of carbon. If the carbon content was high, it would be iron. If the carbon content was low, it would be wrought iron. However, Sulen really didn't know the specific ratio. If I knew that I would travel, I would have memorized all these knowledge points. Sulen rubbed his head and complained. Although he didn't know the exact amount of carbon in steel and iron, as an experienced blacksmith, Bruce still had some experience. Under the leadership of Bruce, several blacksmith apprentices set up the first-class anvils and heated up the iron ingots that had already been smelted into iron ingots before hammering them. This method of repeatedly hammering and heating iron ingot was to forge steel. After the iron ingot was repeatedly tempered, it was called refining. After this operation was repeated for 100 times, it was called refining steel. It was also the best steel on the market at present. Weapons forged with this steel were the best of the best. In the Kingdom of Florence, most of the weapons and armors used by the army were usually refined 30 times. Of course, there were also weapons that were better than this kind of well-tempered steel. Of course, although the technology of the dwarves was higher than that of the humans, in fact, it was also very difficult for the dwarves to forge well-tempered steel. It was just that they had other secret techniques. After seeing that the blacksmith shop was producing normally, Sulen began to look for ways to make money. The territory had been investing in but not producing, which was also very stressful for Sulen. When Johnson left, Sulen gave him 100 kinner. Now, he only had 200 kinner left. There were still some things in the storage space. 2 pieces of fine iron, some gems, and 2 silver treasure chests. The gems were the rewards from defeating the natives last time. Sulen checked them. Most of the gems were of average quality. Only 2 of them were of good quality. If he sold them to a gem merchant, he could sell them for 300 to 400 gold coins at most. This amount of gold coins would probably be spent in a month. It would probably take at least 2 years for the territory to be self-sufficient and have income. At the thought of this, Sulen wanted to rob the giant dragon's treasure. Legend had it that giant dragons were very rich. Of course, he could only think about it. Not to mention that giant dragons were very rare now. Just the power of the giant dragon itself would require at least the legendary level to fight against it. Right? There are still 2 treasure chests that haven't been opened. After saying that, Sulen chose to open the treasure chests. With a flash of light, the treasure chests disappeared, and the sound of a system notification rang in his ears. Congratulations, host. You have obtained a mechanical control book. Congratulations, host. You have obtained a bottle of Big Dipper Heavenly Elixir. Mechanical control? What's this? Sulen picked up the book and flipped through it. The book recorded the creation, principles, and uses of various machines. After reading the system's introduction, Sulen understood that this was a new skill that the system had created after integrating with this world. In the original game, this skill was mechanical control. It could summon mechanical soldiers such as wooden oxen. However, after coming to this world, it had become mechanical control. Moreover, even if he learned it, he wouldn't be able to create wooden oxen. He still needed to improve it. This time, the system didn't cheat him too much. It gave him an upgrade route. First, he needed to upgrade mechanical control to advanced. Then, he needed to learn the mechanical control secret technique. After learning the mechanical control secret technique, he still needed to find an NPC. After the Peach Blossom Immortal passed the NPC's test, he would receive a reward. This reward was awesome. It was actually the creation of puppet magic statues. This system actually gave him the creation of magic statues. It directly turned some of the Iron Men in the game into steel magic statues. Sulen had never seen a steel magic statue before. However, he still knew of its reputation. A steel magic statue had no problem sweeping through a group of knights. Take note that it wasn't a group of knights, but a group of knights. Let's not talk about the puppet magic statues for now. Who knows where to find the Peach Blossom Immortal? In the game, the Peach Blossom Immortal could be found as long as he went to the Peach Forest. Where could he find him in real life? This broken system didn't even give him a hint. Although he couldn't create mechanical puppets, mechanical control was still useful. For example, he could create some simple mechanical tools to speed up the construction of his territory. He could also create a hydraulic forging machine and a hydraulic blower for the blacksmith shop. With the hydraulic forging machine, the speed of forging tempered steel would increase by at least 10 times. After all, how could a human hammer compare to a machine? Moreover, the machine hammered at a uniform speed and had sufficient strength. Originally, he wanted to find some blacksmiths to research it. Now that he had this mechanical control manual, he could definitely create one himself. After learning mechanical control, Sulen picked up a glass bottle beside him. The bottle was filled with a blue translucent liquid. As the bottle shook, the liquid inside flashed with specks of starlight. It looked very beautiful. This item was also very rare in the game. Its effect was very simple. It increased one's attributes. Big Dipper Heavenly Liquid. A mysterious liquid formed by the convergence of the power of the stars. After use, it can increase one's strength or vitality. After use, it can increase one's strength or vitality by 3. Only one effect can be triggered at a time. Can be used repeatedly. Chapter 25. Sulen would never complain about having too many items that could increase his attributes. It was best to have more of them. Sulen picked up the Big Dipper Heavenly Serum and drank it. A cool energy spread through his body and quickly merged with it. Congratulations, host. Your constitution has increased by 3 points. He opened the system to check. On his personal panel, his original 25 constitution had become 28. Sulen stretched his body and adapted to the sudden increase in his constitution. He then prepared to make the hydraulic forging machine. It was not difficult to make a hydraulic forging machine because there were 2 rivers here. Both rivers had plenty of water. It was not a problem to build a hydraulic forging machine. Sulen drew all the parts of the hydraulic forging machine and asked his craftsman to make them according to the drawings. To put it bluntly, the hydraulic forging machine was powered by the water flow. Then, a steering device was used to convert the power from the water flow into the hammering force of the forging hammer. The most important part was actually the conversion device. However, it was very simple. Install a concentric axle on the water flow. The short wooden bar on the axle would move the forging hammer, causing it to rise and fall. This was the simplest hydraulic forging hammer. Sulen made some improvements to it. He used gears to change the rotation speed of the hammer so that the hydraulic forging machine could adjust the rotation speed and hammering force. The craftsmen in Sulen's territory were not bad. Moreover, the hydraulic forging machine's structure was not complicated. Therefore, with his guidance, a hydraulic forging machine was completed in 2 days. Let's begin. Sulen took a deep breath and looked nervously at the freshly made hydraulic forging hammer in front of him. "Open the gate!" one of the craftsmen shouted. As his voice fell, the sluice gate opened, and the surging river water rushed in. The surging river water rushed into the channel that had been excavated, and quickly rushed to the water wheel. The heavy water wheel was driven by the current, and then slowly turned. As the water flow turned, the forging hammer connected to the water flow began to rise slowly. Soon, the heavy forging hammer was raised to a high enough position and then smashed down with a loud bang. Bang! The sound of metal was deafening and sparks flew everywhere. Then, the forging hammer was raised again and smashed down with a loud bang. Bang, bang, bang! The dull sounds of metal colliding rang out continuously, and soon became one. A piece of iron ingot was being hammered by the forging hammer in the water. The shape of the iron ingot could be seen with the naked eye becoming compact. It didn't take long for this iron ingot to be forged into a steel ingot. Sulen picked up the steel ingot sent by Bruce and weighed it with his hand. It was full of weight and toughness. Although it was not as good as the steel he got from the system, it was not much worse. Ding! The construction of the hydraulic forging machine was successful. The hydraulic forging machine will be integrated into the blacksmith shop. Hydraulic forging machine. This is a cleverly designed machine. The machine structure isn't too complicated, and it successfully uses the power of water to forge weapons and equipment. Production efficiency +3. Steel quality +1. Sulen was also very excited when he saw that the system had recognized the hydraulic forging machine. With this hydraulic forging machine, the blacksmith shop's production speed had increased by 3 times. Good job! We can use this steel ingot to produce 35 sets of two-handed axes and armors, Sulen said with satisfaction. How long will it take to complete the forging? Monseigneur, other than me, the blacksmiths are all apprentices. Their skills are still lacking, so the speed of forging armors. Bruce said hesitantly, I'll give you half a month. With the hydraulic forging hammer, the difficulty of forging weapons and equipment has been lowered. If you still can't do it, don't worry, Monseigneur, I promise to complete the task. Sulen's words made Bruce's heart skip a beat. He did not want to bargain anymore and immediately agreed. All right, I'll give you the blueprint later. Just forge the equipment according to the blueprint. Sulen waved his hand and gestured for Bruce to leave. He then opened the system interface and drew the equipment of the barbarian giant axe warriors. Now that he had the conditions, he was ready to equip the barbarians with the recommended equipment. After Sulen drew the blueprint, he asked someone to send it to Bruce. After the first hydraulic forging machine was built, the hydraulic blower was also put on the agenda. With the experience of the hydraulic forging machine, the speed of the blower was faster. It only took 1 day for the blower to be completed. Since it used hydraulic power, the blower was much bigger than the previous human-powered blower. It was 2 meters tall and 3 meters wide. This blower required at least 10 slaves to work together to operate. However, with the help of the water wheel, the blower was easily operated. Huff! Huff! Back and forth, a large amount of heated air was sent into the red-hot blast furnace. The temperature of the boiler, which was already very high, rose again. The heat waves were rolling. A few slaves who were close to the blast furnace were covered in red sweat. However, the sweat was quickly evaporated by the surrounding high temperature. A large amount of crude weapons and some scrap iron were sent into the blast furnace. They were quickly heated up, turned red, and finally became soft and liquefied. Hydraulic blower. A blower that uses hydraulic power to operate. Simple structure, ingenious design, can increase the temperature of the furnace. Work efficiency +2, flame temperature +2. With the hydraulic blower, the temperature in the blast furnace was increased again. The higher temperature accelerated the melting speed of pig iron and ore, and the speed of iron-making increased instantly. With the addition of the hydraulic blower and the hydraulic forging machine, the output of Sulen's blacksmith shop continued to increase. Although there was only one blacksmith shop, it was more than enough to supply the territory. Forging, quenching, grinding. In the blacksmith shop, Bruce and a few blacksmith apprentices were methodically forging weapons and armor. A two-handed axe with a steel blade that was specially made for barbarians was quickly formed. Sulen picked up a completed two-handed axe. This axe was made according to Sulen's blueprint. The two-handed axe purchased by the Kingdom of Florence was made according to the size of an ordinary person. The two-handed axe had a short handle and was much lighter. Compared with the axe in Sulen's hand, it was a whole size smaller. In fact, the barbarians were not very comfortable using it, and the weight of the axe was a little light. The average height of these barbarians was 2.1 meters, which was at least 30 centimeters higher than the Florentines. The weapons made according to the size of the Florentines were not suitable for them. Now the two-handed axe was made according to the size of the barbarians. It was very suitable for them to use. These two-handed axes weighed up to 15 kilograms. Only the barbarians could use them freely. Chapter 26. Because of the use of well-tempered steel, the two-handed axe was sharper and tougher than ordinary axes. Sulen deliberately let a barbarian warrior experiment with the two-handed axe. As a result, the thick pine tree was easily cut in half by him. Even the wolf-tooth club used by the gnolls was cut in 2 or 3 times. The blade of the two-handed axe was only slightly curved. It only needed to be polished again. Hanses, who had obtained a new weapon, excitedly waved the long-handled battle axe. The heavy battle axe in his hand was like a butterfly flying through flowers. The whistling sound of the battle axe breaking through the air could be heard all around. The two-handed battle axe of Florence that he had previously regarded as a treasure was directly thrown into the mud by him. "Boss, this axe is awesome." Hanses waved the axe excitedly and rushed in front of Sulen. The sharp blade of the axe swept past Sulen's side. In an instant, the wooden stick in his hand that was used to measure the depth of the water was cut in half. "It's fun, isn't it?" Looking at the excited Hanses, Sulen directly kicked him and made him roll on the ground. "Pick up the axe and chop down the trees for me. Today, everyone must chop down 30 trees. If you don't finish, there will be no food." A group of barbarians who were watching the fun picked up their axes and ran away. After driving the barbarians away, Sulen picked up another armor. This armor was not a full-body armor but a half-body armor. The lower part was a leg guard. Although this armor did not have as good protection as a full-body armor, it was more flexible and half the cost of a full-body armor. Although the full-body armor had high defense, it was not flexible after wearing it. Turning around would be greatly limited. It was not very practical except for the heavy cavalry. After testing the strength of the half-body armor, Sulen was quite satisfied with this kind of armor. It had a good defensive effect against swords and knives, and also had a high defensive power against arrows, but a little weak against heavy weapons. Using this armor to deal with the natives in the wilderness who did not even have a full set of weapons was a complete waste. The blacksmith shop was on the right track, and the construction of the territory was also slowly progressing. Although there were already more than 1,000 slaves, the construction of the territory was still progressing slowly. Of course, this was in Sulen's opinion. In fact, for others, the construction of the territory was already very fast. The main reason was that Sulen's territory was too large. Other nobles' territories were at most the size of a small town, but Sulen's territory was already a large town or even a small town. At least large towns did not have a 2-kilometer-long, 5-meter-high stone wall. Kobolds, gnomes, and even gnolls were not the best slaves for building a territory. These slaves could only do heavy physical labor. With their pitiful intelligence, they were completely incapable of building a proper house. Most of them built shacks or dug underground caverns. There were a lot of trees in the wilderness. If they used logs to build houses, they would be able to build faster. However, wooden houses were prone to catching fire. Once a fire broke out, they would probably burn down a lot. Furthermore, wooden houses consumed too much wood. In Sulen's opinion, the territory's wood was also a commodity for sale. There were a lot of trees in the wilderness, and there were a lot of them. They were also very sturdy. Whether it was used to make furniture or ships, it was a good choice. This was especially true in the north. Due to the cold weather, trees grew slower, and their texture was more compact and sturdy. It was very suitable for building ships. He planned to sell the wood as the territory's first commodity. Because it was in the north, the weather was very cold in the winter. The houses in the territory were made of mud mixed with reed poles. Although the mud walls looked ugly and gray and looked like they could be pushed down with a push, they were very warm. The walls were more than a foot thick and could completely block the cold from the northern ice plains. Although the walls were a mixture of mud and reed, after the mud was mixed with water and mixed with reed poles, the strength of the mud wall increased a lot. Coupled with the thickness of the mud wall, it was no problem to use it to build houses. At the same time, wooden pillars were added in the mud wall. Although the houses looked ugly, they were the best choice for the territory. Although the kobolds and goblins were not very bright, they were still capable of digging the foundation and transporting the mud. They did a good job of digging the foundation. It didn't take long for the foundation to be dug out. As for the gnomes and gnolls, they were stronger. They were used to beat the mud and mix it. Then, under the guidance of the humans, they built the mud wall on top of the foundation. The construction of the mud wall was simple. 2 wooden boards were erected, and the boards were filled with mixed mud and reed poles. After that, the mud wall was compacted and built. Neither gnolls nor gnolls were comfortable with their new identities. After all, they were much stronger than gnolls and kobolds. They were used to enslaving gnolls and kobolds. They were not used to being enslaved by humans, but they did not dare to resist. In the recent battle, Su Luan's powerful figure and the barbarians' unstoppable power had left a deep impression on them. Although there were only a few barbarians as supervisors, none of the slaves dared to have any thoughts of resistance. They obediently worked under the whips. There was flat land on both sides of the Red Sand River and the Whitewater River. Many of these lands were covered with lush weeds. The land was very fertile. After the monster army was wiped out, the territory was temporarily free of threats. The reclamation of farmland was put on the agenda. Agriculture would always be the foundation of a territory. With a strong agriculture, the territory would be able to support more people. This way, business and military would be able to develop better. Su Luan had checked the land around the river for 2 days. In the area close to his territory, at least 100,000 mu of land could be reclaimed on both sides of the river. Because it was close to the river, there was no need to worry about irrigation. These 100,000 mu of land could be said to be the best farmland in the entire territory. Su Luan's farmland was close to the city wall. Other than being close to the city, it had no advantage over these farmland. Of course, now that Su Luan had good mechanical technology, if he built some big water wheels and irrigation canals along the river, the farmland here would not be bad. However, the construction of the water wheels and irrigation canals required a lot of money and labor. With the current situation of Su Luan's territory, it was not realistic to build irrigation canals that covered the city. The best way was to reclaim the land near the river for farmland. Chapter 27. Kobolds and goblins also knew how to grow food, but their method of sowing was the most primitive slash-and-burn method. They would find a piece of barren land and set a fire to burn all the weeds on the ground. When it rained, they would scatter some seeds on the ground. As for the harvest, that was entirely up to fate. Although the goblins and kobolds were bad at farming, they were still capable of reclaiming barren land. Su Luan planned to reclaim 5,000 mu of land in his territory before the north wind arrived. At the very least, his territory had to be self-sufficient in terms of food. These barbarians were all gluttons. The amount of food they consumed was 3 times that of ordinary people. In this world, apart from nobles and merchants, ordinary people ate 2 meals a day. These barbarians were the same. However, Su Luan planned to eat 3 meals a day. As the main fighting force, they could not fight on an empty stomach. The only problem was the lack of food. There were 45 slave artisans and 35 barbarian warriors in the camp. After a while, the barbarian women and children would also arrive. By then, there would be a total of 124 barbarians, 40 mercenaries, and more than 1,000 native slaves. With so many mouths to feed, the amount of food they consumed had quadrupled. What used to be a few months' worth of food was now only enough for 2 months at most. If he wanted to develop his territory, he needed enough manpower. Although there were more than 1,000 people in his territory, the goblins, gnolls, and kobolds were definitely not allowed to join his territory. Su Luan understood this principle very well. That was why he did not have many people in his territory. Races like the barbarians and dwarves weren't that different from humans. At the very least, they didn't have the custom of cannibalism. Gnolls, kobolds, and goblins didn't have any taboos. They wouldn't even let the corpses of their allies and clansmen go, let alone humans. The gnolls did not only use the goblins as cannon fodder. In fact, they also used them as food. When there was not enough food, the gnolls and kobolds would be eaten directly. Therefore, these monsters could only be treated as slaves. They could not be allowed to join the territory as free people. North of the Red Sand River, Su Luan led a group of barbarian warriors to clear out the goblins and kobolds. Because the surrounding tribes had all been wiped out by Su Luan, there were still groups of 3 to 5 wandering goblins and kobolds in the wilderness. These weed-like monsters would probably form a new tribe in a few months. In order to maintain the rule of this land, Sulen would come every once in a while to clean up some and capture some as slaves. The construction of the territory was very heavy. Even in the 21st century of his previous life, there were many safety guarantees, but there were still all kinds of accidents. In this world where the productivity was not even comparable to the Middle Ages, it was normal for a few slaves to die. Therefore, in order to ensure the progress of the project, it was necessary to capture some slaves every once in a while. Boss, we've discovered a small goblin tribe in the forest ahead. There are about 200 to 300 goblins, including some earth goblins. A barbarian who had returned from scouting reported. Sulen nodded and opened the strategic map in the system. At this time, the strategic map had already marked the location of the group of goblins. He had already discovered that as long as he or his army passed by, the originally black area on the map would disappear and the situation of the land would be revealed. Just like now, in the forest 5 kilometers northeast of them, it was marked that a group of goblins lived here. The strategic map was not only useful within the territory. After confirming the location of the goblin tribe, Sulen prepared to bring the barbarians to kill all the goblins. The dozen barbarians split into 2 teams and went around the camp from both sides. Sulen led 2 barbarians to attack from the front. The goblins had low combat strength and weak willpower. The death of their companions would have a great impact on them. In fact, even a single barbarian warrior could defeat them. After 10 minutes, Sulen had arrived outside the goblin tribe. There was no need for a sneak attack to deal with these goblins. A wave of attacks would be enough to end the battle. The next step would be to capture the slaves. There were no guards outside the goblin tribe. The entire goblin camp looked run down. There were many small houses piled up with mud. These houses were actually called crypts. Most of them were underground and had no windows. There was only one entrance, and the surroundings were supported by wood. Although they looked run down, these houses were good at keeping warm. Many poor people in the north absorbed the advantages of these crypts and built half of their houses underground. Sulen looked at the strategic map. The other 2 teams of barbarians had already arrived at their predetermined positions. He waved his hand and led 2 barbarians to the camp. The 3 of them were quickly discovered by the goblins. One of the goblins picked up his weapon and yelled at the other goblins to pick up their weapons and get into formation. However, before he could complete the formation, a hand axe spun and smashed into his head. Kill! Su Luan brandished his steel spear and smashed the fence outside the camp to pieces with the force of 10,000 pounds. The goblins who had just come to their senses crawled out of the crypt in a panic. When they saw the tall barbarian, they did not even have time to react before they were sliced in half by the axe. For a moment, the 3 of them were like 3 meat grinders, rampaging through the territory. The remaining goblins were scared out of their wits. Before the fight even started, they had already scattered and turned to flee. Only a few goblins picked up their broken weapons and formed a simple military formation to resist. Seeing this situation, Sulen adjusted his direction and charged forward. He swept his steel spear across and sent a few goblins flying like a sandstorm. Although there were no obvious wounds on the surface of these goblins, the leather armor on their backs had exploded. Broken organs mixed with blood spurted out of their mouths. They were dead before they hit the ground. With the death of a few goblins, no other goblins dared to resist. All the goblins scrambled to escape. However, they ran into the barbarian warriors who were waiting for them as soon as they ran out of the camp. Faced with an even greater number of barbarian warriors, these goblins who were already out of their wits only felt that the entire world was filled with malice towards them. The battle ended quickly. The 3 sides surrounded the goblins. Apart from a few dozen dead goblins and a few lucky ones who managed to escape, the rest of the goblins were all sprawled on the ground, their bodies trembling as they huddled together. Do it according to the old rules. Kill the old and weak. Tie up the rest and take them back as slaves. Chapter 28. These barbarians were already familiar with this. They arranged for people to collect the spoils of war while tying the goblins up. As expected, this goblin tribe did not have much wealth. There were only a few metal weapons. Other than the goblin slaves, there was basically no additional income. After a simple rest, the team was split into two. One group of barbarians escorted the 200 goblin slaves back to the camp, while Su Len led a few other barbarians to continue patrolling the area. The army passed through the forest and advanced toward the northeast. A rolling mountain appeared in the distant horizon. The huge mountain range was like a giant beast that stretched across the land. That was the Kandarl Mountains. The Whitewater River that flowed through the territory originated from this mountain range. The wilderness in autumn was a little dilapidated. The plants had begun to turn yellow. The animals that needed to hibernate had begun to store fat for themselves to survive the winter. This was also the season when animals were at their fattest. Su Len found a place with a wide view and ordered the army to rest and prepare for dinner. A barbarian warrior hunted an antelope nearby. These barbarian warriors used to be hunters in the wilderness. Hunting an antelope was a piece of cake. Soon, after a simple preparation, a warrior began to roast the antelope. Boss, about 5 kilometers to the east, we found a herd of wild cows. Just as Su Len was about to cut the meat, a barbarian who was sent out to investigate ran back and reported. Herd of wild cows? How many are there? Hearing that there was a herd of wild cows, Su Len did not care about roasting the meat. He threw the meat to a barbarian warrior beside him and reached out to grab the barbarian who had reported the situation. Very big. A very big herd. The barbarian was not very sensitive to numbers. He drew a big circle in front of him with his hands. Are there as many of them as the goblin tribe we just wiped out? Su Len asked as he took the meat from the soldier behind him and passed it to the warrior. After taking the meat, the warrior took a few big bites and said, "Not as many as the goblins, about half of them. They should be preparing to migrate." Less than half. Sullen's eyes lit up, but he kept calculating in his heart. A small half meant about 100 bison. 100 bison was not a small number. No matter if he caught them to eat meat or use them for farming, these bison could not be let go. Right now, the territory was planning to cultivate 5,000 mu of land. Although they had put in a lot of effort, the progress was still slow. If they had oxen, the 5,000 mu of land could be cultivated in a few days. Moreover, in the coming year they could cultivate more land. Everyone hurry up and eat. We'll gather in 10 minutes. Thinking of this, Su Len immediately said. He was ready to catch all the bison immediately. After all, these bison had legs. If he was late, who knew where they would run to? Soon, all the barbarian warriors had finished their preparations, and Su Len rushed towards the direction of the herd under the lead of the soldier. There were both cattle plowing and horse plowing in this world. Horse plowing was faster while cattle plowing was slower. Both had their advantages and disadvantages. The group quickly moved towards the northeast line of defense. After about 15 minutes, Su Len and his men arrived at the location that the scout had mentioned. It was a high slope with a wide field of vision. The surrounding environment was unobstructed. Below the slope was a plain, and the herd of bison was leisurely grazing on the plains. There were a lot of bison. Su Len counted at least 130. Such a large herd of bison was rare in the wilderness. Although bison were ordinary beasts, they were more ferocious. These animals could weigh up to a ton and were at least 3 meters long. They also had a pair of curved and sharp horns on their heads. At first glance, one could tell that they were very lethal. These bison were also herd animals, which made them even more dangerous. More than 100 bison that weighed more than a ton charged together like thunder. The consequences of their charge were no less than the charge of the Empire's heavy cavalry. There are so many bison. We can't let any of them go, Su Len said excitedly. With these bison, the reclamation of the territory could be sped up. The barbarians were very experienced in taming bison. After all, when they lived in the wilderness, their tribes had reared many bison. Now that they were here to catch bison, this was their old profession. Because he was worried that the herd would scatter, Sulen prepared to catch the leader of the herd. He spread out his men and let the barbarians form a circle around the herd. Then, Sulen personally went to catch the leader of the herd. In fact, it wasn't difficult to distinguish the leader of the herd. The strongest one was the leader. Sulen stood on the high hill and scanned the area, trying to find the leader. After a few rounds of observation, Sulen finally confirmed the leader of the herd. As he approached the herd, the bison that were grazing were very alert to Sulen's arrival. A few of them were even ready to charge at Sulen and knock him away at any time. They mooed a few times at Sulen, then pointed their horns at Sulen and kicked their front hooves back and forth a few times. Sulen didn't care about these bison's provocation. He walked toward the herd without any hesitation. Seeing that Sulen ignored their warning, a few of the bad-tempered male bison charged at Sulen. In the end, Sulen punched them in the head and knocked them out. Since he wanted to catch these bison for farming, he naturally couldn't use too much strength. What if he killed them? After knocking out these bison, Sulen didn't stop at all. He quickly rushed toward the leader of the herd. The leader of the herd didn't show any signs of weakness. He also rushed toward Sulen. As the leader, this bison was even bigger. It was more than 3 meters long and had a lot of followers behind it. Unfortunately, it met Sulen. Before it could show its strength, it was knocked down by Sulen. Shaking its head, the leader stood up shakily. As soon as it stood up, Sulen jumped on its back. After realizing that there was someone on its back, the leader tried to throw Sulen off. However, no matter how hard it tried, Sulen sat firmly on its back. In the end, the leader of the herd was exhausted and couldn't throw Sulen off. Could only bow its head and admit defeat to Sulen. After successfully taming the leader of the herd, the remaining 100 or so bison were no longer a problem. The leader mooed a few times at the herd, and the originally restless herd calmed down. Then, Sulen rode the leader of the herd and led them toward the territory. The other barbarians followed on his left and right. The 100 or so bison running gave off an unstoppable momentum. Chapter 29. After capturing more than 100 bulls, Sulen did not continue to venture deeper into the wilderness. He planned to bring them back to camp first. Even if only half of these bulls could be turned into cattle, it would still be a huge improvement for Sulen's agriculture. As for the advantages of cattle plowing compared to horses, Sulen was so poor that he couldn't even afford horses, let alone horse plowing. Moreover, horses were much harder to raise than cattle, even though they were fast and plowed a lot. Whether it was military horses or ordinary horses, the requirements for raising them were very high. Horses were very delicate animals and were easily damaged. A good military horse in Kalt would cost at least 30 kinner. The better ones would cost 40 or even 50 kinner. Moreover, these military horses needed to be fed with fine feed and extra meals at night. It could be said that the feed for these horses was better than what most people ate. A military horse like this would consume at least 10 kinners worth of food every year. Although ordinary horses did not need to be fed so well, they would still need at least 3 kinners worth of food every year. It should be noted that many commoners only earned about 5 kinners worth of food a year. In comparison, the cost of raising cattle was much lower. Moreover, when a horse died, it would only be left with a piece of horse skin. When the cow was old, its meat could be sold for money. Not to mention, the horns could be used to make bows. Naturally, cattle plowing was more cost-effective. The bulls Sulen brought back were very irritable and difficult to tame. It was not easy for ordinary people to tame them. Most of the time, they would even hurt themselves. However, this was not a problem for the barbarians. The barbarian tribes in the northern wilderness would usually catch wild bulls to raise. Taming wild bulls was a basic skill for them. Moreover, Sulen had an ultimate method of taming wild bulls: piercing their nostrils. The nose of a bull was very sensitive. After piercing their nostrils, even the most irritable of wild bulls would become obedient babies. As for the fact that adult bulls were too strong to pierce their nostrils, 2 barbarian warriors would be able to easily pin them to the ground. When they returned to the camp, Su Len counted the bison. There were 97 adult bison, 42 of them were bulls, and the rest were cows. There were 21 one-year-old calves. Su Len intended to let the barbarian women and children feed and cultivate these buffaloes. In the present camp, these women and children were the most suitable. As time passed, Su Len had been in the wilderness for a month. After the hard work of more than 1,000 goblins, kobolds, and gnolls, the camp changed every day. The pier of the Red Sand River had expanded a lot. From the beginning, there were only 3 fishing boats. Now, there were 7 fishing boats. The berths at the port had also expanded by 5 times. It could accommodate more ships loading and unloading goods at the same time. Downstream of the river, a row of 4 water wheels stood by the river. These water wheels were the hydraulic machinery of the blacksmith shop. 2 of them were hydraulic forgers, one was a hydraulic blower, and the other was a crusher used to crush ores or scrap iron. However, there were no iron mines in the territory, so this machine was not in operation. The walls of the camp were all made of stone. The 5-meter-high and 1-meter-thick walls surrounded the entire camp. Although these walls were far inferior to those in Carenta City, or even Blackstone City, they were enough to defend against the goblins, kobolds, and gnolls. With these walls, the safety factor of the territory was increased by 50%. In addition to the walls, many roads in the territory were opened. From the establishment of the camp to the sawmill, the port, and the farmlands, many of these roads were paved with stones. Large amounts of polished cobblestones were scattered on the riverbank. Su Len had the goblins and kobolds transport them up in bamboo baskets to pave the roads. To build these roads, they first flattened the soil, then sprinkled water on it. After the cobblestones were pressed in, they were rolled back and forth with stone rollers. In the end, the roads were smooth and firm. Even on rainy days, they would not become muddy, and on sunny days, they would not become dusty. In terms of roads alone, Su Len was already better than many of the major human cities of this era. On both sides of the roads were drainage canals that were about 1 meter wide and half a meter deep. According to Sullen's plan, the entire camp must have a complete drainage system that could discharge all the sewage in the city. He could not tolerate his territory being shrouded in the smell of fermented feces and urine like the other cities of this era. Outside the walls, not far from the river, more than 500 goblins and kobolds were using tools to cultivate the farmlands under the supervision of a few human mercenaries. A team of supervisors was urging them to work hard. If any slave dared to slack off, a whip would quickly come down and tear his flesh apart. These supervisors were not humans. They were also goblins and kobolds. After a period of enslavement, some of the smarter goblins and kobolds took the initiative to pledge allegiance to the humans. Su Len thought about it and agreed. After all, the territory was severely understaffed, and these goblin supervisors could make up for it. As for the goblin supervisors going easy on the workers, such a situation would never happen. With the selfish, arrogant, and cowardly personalities of the goblins, they bullied their own kind even more than the humans after becoming supervisors. If they did not do well, Su Len would not punish them. He would just throw them back, and the oppressed goblin slaves would treat them well. Su Len also discovered a problem. The slave supervisors were actually recognized by the system. Goblin supervisor. Increase goblin work efficiency by 20%. Decrease slave safety by 10%. It was originally a goblin, but in order to eat better food every day, it decided to pledge allegiance to Su Len. It has a decent talent for languages and has learned a part of the human language. It can communicate with humans. At the same time, it is familiar with the goblins' habits and can better command the goblins. Apart from the goblins, there were also kobolds and even gnolls who were willing to pledge allegiance to him as supervisors. This greatly reduced the lack of manpower in the camp. Su Len was used to the clean and tidy layout of the cities in his previous life. He had the same requirements for his territory. In his city plan, the roads were neat and tidy, and there were drains on both sides of the roads. There were even flower beds on both sides of the roads. In the gaps between the roads were neatly divided plots of land. These plots of land were either houses or shops, giving off a clean and tidy feeling. On every street, there were public toilets set up at the same location. If the city was built according to Sulan's design, it would definitely be the cleanest city in the world. Chapter 30. Su Luan's lord's castle was under construction. According to the design, his lord's castle was very spectacular and majestic. But considering the current situation, he could only build part of it first and leave the rest for the time being. He would continue the construction when he had enough time and money. It wasn't that he didn't want to capture more slaves to work for him, but the main problem was food. Without enough food, it was impossible to feed more people. The first 500 mu of farmland had been planted with potatoes. These potatoes would mature before winter, and now Sulen was preparing to expand the planting of potatoes. The first batch of land was very fertile. Even without fertilizer, the yield would not be low. Apart from keeping some of these lands, Su Luan planned to distribute the rest through military rewards, sales, or distribution to slaves with meritorious service. As long as the land was planted with crops, the territory would receive agricultural taxes. The sale of the land would also receive a sum of money. This way, his territory would have a stable source of income. Of course, this was the best-case scenario. His territory was now in the middle of nowhere, and no free people were willing to come. Therefore, this method ended before it even started. If he wanted to increase the population of his territory by attracting free people, it would be better to buy slaves. Su Luan's territory was like an upside-down bowl. The camp was at the highest point of the bowl, surrounded by 2 rivers and surrounded by plains. Su Luan had also measured the land that could be reclaimed when he patrolled the territory during this period. After marking it on the strategic map, he calculated that the land that could be cultivated was more than 200 square kilometers. If all of this land was cultivated, at least 300,000 mu of farmland would be cultivated. With so much farmland, it would be more than enough to feed 30,000 to 50,000 people. Of course, even if the territory was developed, it still needed to clear out the monsters in the wilderness. 2 days later, Johnson returned with dozens of barbarian women and children. With these women and children joining the territory, the manpower in the territory was finally not so tight. These women and children were very curious about the territory, but they quickly threw themselves into the construction. According to Sulan's reward standards, these barbarian soldiers could obtain land and get rid of their status as slaves to become citizens of the territory. After knowing that they could rid themselves of their status as slaves and become free citizens, these barbarians burst with passion and threw themselves into building up their territories. What surprised Sulen was that, other than the barbarians, there was also a caravan that came back with Johnson. This caravan had 44-wheeled carriages and more than 150 people. Honorable Lord, I'm Owen, the manager of the Bauhinia Chamber of Commerce. I'm very pleased to meet you here. A slightly plump man with a shrewd look flashed through his eyes from time to time. My caravan will need to pass through your territory. We will pay the tax according to the normal standards. Owen, is your caravan going to the depths of the wilderness? Sulen was very interested in Owen. Any caravan that dared to venture into the wilderness was no weakling. With the danger level of the wilderness, caravans that were not strong enough had a high chance of dying. If this caravan dared to do business in the wilderness, they must be strong. At the same time, this also showed that they would definitely make a lot of money on this trip. If there were not enough profits, why would these caravans take such a huge risk to come here? Mr. Lu soon said it well. If there was a 10% profit, the capital would be used everywhere. If there was a 20% profit, the capital would be active. If there was a 50% profit, the capital would take risks. If there was a 100% profit, the capital would dare to trample all the laws of the world. If there was a 300% profit or more, the capital would dare to commit any crime and even risk being beheaded. Sulen was about to go crazy from poverty. How could he let go of any opportunity to make a fortune? Owen was also very surprised. He was surprised that the noble in front of him had set up a settlement here. As a caravan that often traveled in the wilderness, they knew very well how difficult it was to set up a camp here. The Jackalan tribes in the wilderness were not easy to deal with. Thousands of jackalans, goblins, houndhead men, and trolls. With such a lineup, even 1,000 well-trained elite human soldiers might not be able to win. Most of the time, both sides would suffer. Moreover, this territory had already built a 5-meter-tall wall. How much manpower and resources did it take to build such a wall? One had to know that this place was more than 200 kilometers away from the nearest city, Blackstone City. To maintain 1,000 human soldiers and build such a wall, the cost would make most nobles go bankrupt. This young human noble dared to build a city here. What was even more surprising was that he found a large number of goblins, houndhead men, and jack-allen slaves in this territory. This meant that they had a firm foothold here. Yes, Lord. Our caravan is preparing to enter the depths of the wilderness to trade with some other races. Jack-allans? No, jack-allans prefer to rob directly. We are trading with the Ellen tribe in the north. They are a group of centaurs. Centaurs? Sulen said in surprise. Yes. Sulen wanted to continue asking, but Owen had no intention of talking about the details of the trade. But even if Owen did not say it, Sulen had a rough idea of what they were trading. It was nothing more than bows and arrows, horses, and some wilderness specialties such as furs and magic materials. Centaurs were good at raising horses, and their tribe was also famous for their longbows. The caravan traded food and other daily necessities. A round trip would yield at least 10 times the profit. Okay, I agree to let your caravan rest here, but according to the rules, you have to pay 10% tax. Sulen quickly agreed. Of course, you can pay with kinner or food. Thank you for your kindness, Lord. We will prepare the tax soon. Hearing Sulen's words, Owen nodded. 10% tax was normal. In fact, Owen had considered not paying the taxes, but after seeing the size of the territory, he dismissed the idea. There was no need to be surprised. Few merchants in the wilderness were good people. They would often act as bandits and even plunder some territories. Although Sulen's territory looked simple, the power it represented was not something ordinary people could achieve. Without a strong military force, they could not defeat the monster army. Not to mention capturing so many wilderness natives as slaves. Chapter 31. Centaurs were a powerful race in this world. They were born to be cavalry and were good at raising horses and archery. Centaur longbows were very famous in the human world. They were second only to elven longbows and were comparable to half-elven bows. The strongest thunder knights in the kingdom of Florence bought their horses from the Centaur tribe. The horses produced by the Centaur tribe were fat, tall, and strong. They were the best horses and were very suitable for heavy cavalry mounts. Of course, there were many better mounts such as magic beasts. Magic beasts that were beyond the category of wild beasts, such as unicorns and nightmare beasts. If they formed a knight order, they would be stronger than all the knights on the continent. However, there was a key problem. Whether it was unicorns, nightmare beasts, or other magic beasts, there were too few of them. Unicorns were the elves' friends and lived in the legendary elven forest. Nightmare beasts were even rarer. There were also a few. Therefore, only a few noble knights would look for magic beasts as mounts. The knights that needed a lot of mounts could only use ordinary horses. Humans also domesticated a lot of horses, but the quality was not as good as the horses raised by the centaurs. Even if there were 1 or 2 good horses, it could not change the fact that the whole race was not as good as the horses raised by the centaurs. Sulen knew that Owen's caravan was going to trade with the centaur tribe, so he had some plans in his mind. Now that his territory only had barbarian warriors, he also needed cavalry and longbow archers. But now his territory was poor. If he wanted to trade with the centaur tribe, he had to at least have something they needed. How could he trade with them if he had nothing? Sulen was also a little confused, but he also had an advantage. Now his territory was the only territory on the trade route from the kingdom of Florence to the centaur tribe. As long as they passed through his territory, it was normal to pay a toll. It was normal to collect some centaur longbows and horses. Owen's caravan was transporting a lot of goods this time. There were a lot of ironware and the rest were food. Although the centaur tribe was very strong, the quality of their ironware was average. Iron ore was rare in the wilderness, so the price of ironware was very high. As for food, the Centaur tribe was a semi-nomadic tribe. Their farming ability was very poor and their food production was low. In comparison, Sulen suddenly realized that his territory was still very advantageous. Owen was also curious about Sulen. As the steward of the Bauhinia Chamber of Commerce, he had been walking on this trade route for more than 10 years. During this period, there had been nobles who had come to this area to develop their territories. However, until Sulen's arrival, no nobles had succeeded in establishing themselves here. Owen had never thought that in just a month, a pioneering noble would come here and successfully establish a foothold here. This made him feel incredibly shocked. What surprised him even more was the strength of this lord. Previously, he had crossed the wilderness with the barbarian women and children. Along the way, they had encountered many wilderness bandits. The barbarian leader had led 2 equally powerful barbarians to crush a group of bandits. That kind of irresistible and invincible attitude left a deep impression on him. None of the mercenaries under him were his opponent, and only a few of them could take a few of his axes. This kind of strength had already surpassed the knight rank. Even the remaining 2 barbarian warriors had reached the knight rank. Towards such powerful warriors, his first thought was to recruit them. In order to recruit them, Owen had promised to give them land and Kinnur to settle down the barbarian women and children. However, to his disappointment, the barbarians had directly rejected him. Even if he kept raising the conditions, the barbarians did not waver at all. Just as he was thinking of increasing the price, the caravan had arrived at Sulen's territory. When he arrived, he realized that the barbarians were actually this pioneering noble's people. Moreover, this young noble had relied on the barbarian warriors to establish a foothold in the wilderness. Owen sat cross-legged on the carpet in the tent. Not only was the carpet from the desert kingdom exquisite, but it was also soft and comfortable to step on. A short table was placed on the carpet, and the leaders of the caravan guards were respectfully sitting not far away. Each of them had a cup of ale in front of them. The temperature in the wastelands was very low at night, and alcohol was the most popular beverage in the north. On a cold night, drinking a cup of ale would heat up one's stomach, and one's body, which had been frozen stiff, would quickly warm up. Alec, other than the 3 barbarian warriors who came with us, how are the other barbarians' strength? Owen put down his cup and asked. Very strong. The mercenary with a long scar on his face said in a low voice, Those barbarians have an aura. I've only seen this kind of aura from knight-rank powerhouses. After he finished speaking, he lowered his head and took a sip of ale. The spicy ale was a little bitter. He did not like this kind of cheap ale, but he subconsciously wanted to hide the shock in his heart. Although he did not want to admit it, with his many years of experience as a mercenary, it was not difficult to see that each of the barbarian warriors in this territory could be called a strong warrior. All of them? That's impossible. More than 30 strong men who are at least at the knight level. How can they be willing to stay in this broken territory where they have no money and no men, and where they have to face the attacks of gnolls and other monsters all the time as ordinary soldiers? Owen could not accept this situation at all. More than 30 knights were already comparable to some weak counts in the kingdom of Florence. Although these barbarians were not knights, their fighting strength was not inferior to knights. If they were willing to be loyal to the nobles, even if they could not become knights, their treatment would definitely be better than here. In this world, strength and status were directly proportional. Those high-grade warriors were all supported, but the warriors in this territory were like ordinary soldiers. This was completely unreasonable. Owen's mind was filled with thoughts, and the bamboo cup in his hand unconsciously turned in his hand. Could it be a different situation? Just when everyone else was silent, a thin mercenary with a cold expression said while playing with a dagger in his hand, "These barbarians have no idea what kind of treatment they can get in the kingdom with their strength." After the others looked at him, the mercenary slowly said, "Clap." Owen clapped his hands and excitedly stood up as he said, "That's right. How could those barbarians and country bumpkins know the value of 100 gold coins? That's the only explanation why they're here. Chapter 32. I know they must have been tricked by that lord. As long as I tell them my true value, those barbarians will definitely leave him. Then our chance will come. Owen paced around the tent excitedly. From his expression, it seemed like he had already recruited more than 30 powerful barbarian warriors. I'm so stupid. No wonder Johnson didn't care about my conditions. They don't even know the difference between silk and linen. I should have known. Ahem, sir, we are now in the territory of that noble lord. Doing this seems. The leader of the mercenaries, Alec, reminded him. Yes, this is still his territory. Owen finally came to his senses and stopped. However, he couldn't hide the excitement on his face. His eyes flickered continuously, and no one knew what he was plotting in his heart. The next morning, Owen handed a carriage full of goods to Wang Yi's tax. Su Len accepted it without hesitation. He was so poor that he didn't need to be so courteous. After paying the tax, Owen requested that their caravan rest in the city for 2 days before leaving. Su Len agreed to his request. Su Len ordered the slaves to move the goods from the carriage to the warehouse. When they were in the warehouse, Su Len checked that the carriages were filled with food. This was good news for Su Len. Due to the sudden increase in population, he didn't have enough food. A carriage like this could carry 1,000 pounds of goods. 1,000 pounds of food might not be much in Cult City, but here the value of 1,000 pounds of food was at least 10 times higher. There weren't many types of trade in the wasteland. Tea, cloth, salt, and so on. The most popular trade was ironware. Grain wasn't the most profitable. Owen brought so much food because the Centaur tribe requested that there must be a certain percentage of grain and ironware in the trade. Originally, the Centaur tribe didn't lack food. However, they had been at war with an orc tribe for the past few years. Naturally, they didn't have enough food. If it weren't for the caravans transporting large amounts of food, the Centaur tribe wouldn't have been able to survive. Now that they were able to hold on, it was their opponents' turn to suffer. The long war had caused them to lack food. They had been evenly matched at the beginning, but now they were barely holding on. On the second day after the barbarian women and children arrived, Su Len began to distribute houses and land to the barbarians. There were already 50 to 60 houses in the camp. Although the houses made of mud and reeds didn't look good, it was still comfortable to live in. It was much better than the houses the barbarians used to live in. Each of the 35 barbarian warriors was given a house. Apart from them, the women and children of Su Len were also given a house. Although they didn't have any battle achievements or points, they could still owe them. In addition to the houses, each family was given 20 mu of farmland and 30 mu of wasteland to cultivate. As for the wild bulls, they also needed to be exchanged for battle merits or points. Of course, if he didn't have enough battle merits or points, he could still owe them. Soon, more than 30 of the 100 or so bison were distributed. Su Len also rewarded the mercenaries with land, but it was much less than the barbarians. Most of them were about 5 mu. After all, the mercenaries had limited battle merits, and the points they earned every day were also very little. After receiving the land, the group of mercenaries was also very happy. Although the days of the mercenaries seemed to be very carefree, and some bards said that the mercenaries' adventurous life was magnificent, but in reality, most of the mercenaries didn't have a good life. Many of the mercenaries didn't have land, money, or proper jobs. In the end, they could only be mercenaries. Of course, many of them became bandits. If there was land to farm, many mercenaries wouldn't be in this line of work. In the Kingdom of Florence, the land had already been distributed. Except for some farmers, the rest of the land was basically divided up by the nobles. With the growth of the population, the farmers who didn't have land could only leave their hometown and come to the city to work. They didn't have any skills, so most of them became coolies or mercenaries. Now that they had land, these people naturally didn't want to live a life of bloodshed. It was foreseeable that these mercenaries would become the first batch of free people in Sullen's territory. Just as Su Len was busy distributing land to the mercenaries, Owen also began to secretly contact the barbarians. Most of the barbarians were forthright and carefree. After facing a businessman like Owen, they quickly had a good impression of him. After gaining the initial trust, Owen began to tell these barbarians what kind of treatment powerful warriors like them should receive. He also promised that as long as they were willing to follow him back to the Kingdom of Florence, all of these could be realized. However, to his disappointment, the barbarian mercenaries were not interested in the knighthood or the treatment of nobles that Owen had mentioned. Hence, they directly rejected his recruitment. Owen couldn't accept this at all. Of course, he didn't give up. Instead, he went to contact other barbarians. The result was exactly the same as before. All the barbarians rejected Owen's recruitment. This was unexpected. Damn it, what's going on? Why are those barbarians still unwilling to cooperate with me after I explain things so clearly? Owen said angrily in the tent of the caravan's encampment. The other mercenaries around him looked at each other a few times, but no one answered. Sir, is it because these barbarians don't trust us? One of the people who looked like a merchant said. After all, we just met them. It's normal for those barbarians to be vigilant. Maybe we should take out something to show them our sincerity? That's also a way. Then I'll leave this matter to you. Owen thought for a while and still wasn't willing to give up, so he decided. If Sulen knew what Owen and the others were thinking, he would definitely laugh himself to death. All the barbarians had a loyalty value on the system interface. Now, most of these loyalty values were above 90, and there were even some that were above 100. With such a high loyalty value, it wasn't something that could make them betray. Moreover, the barbarians worshipped the strong. After following Sulen for a while, many of them had become loyal to Sulen. It was basically impossible for them to betray him. You're tuning in to the Journey of the Soul YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.